Hi, Lester, Wushu Engineer. Sorry about the humming in the background. I've got the air conditioner on. Queensland's still quite hot. It's Christmas time, just gone New Year's. It's actually New Year's Day today as I'm recording this. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was teaching a very small class of Kung Fu students up at one of the local universities, university campuses here in regional Queensland, Australia. At the start of the class, I was approached by one of the security guards who worked at the uni on the campus. He wanted his son to try out one of our classes because he had seen us around and was interested in watching a class and in his son trying one out. His son had accompanied him. Some of the people who approach me for lessons start by explaining their lengthy and comprehensive martial arts and combat pedigree. The security guard was one of these people. Usually these are the kinds of people who do not last the first class because they have too many preconceived ideas, not the least of which is an overinflated opinion of their own competence. However, I typically do not judge these folk and let the training perform the task of sifting potential candidates for me. Anyway, in this case, it was the security guard's son who would be training. So I said sure. During the class, I introduced the security guard's son to basic concepts such as movement, defensive stances, basic kicks and punches, and of course our guard position. I felt the twin laser beams of the security guard's eyes burning into the back of my skull during the lesson. After the lesson was complete, I dismissed the class, and this was when the security guard came up for a conversation. He began by critiquing our defensive position. Our traditional system of Kung Fu, like many others, often makes use of an extended guard position with the arms and hands on center line. He took great offense to that, although I was sure that he had told me that he had practiced some form of traditional Kung Fu, so I'm not sure what he got taught. So I explained that in our system, an extended guard is sometimes used to allow for more defensive and offensive reactions at a greater distance. In other words, closer to one's opponent, which allows for faster response with more time to react to attacks that breach the primary guard. In addition, the extended guard is used to make rapid contact with the opponent to allow for a momentary, faster, tactile feedback loop to be established with the opponent. These reasons failed to convince the security guard, who had been drilled into believing that he had to keep his hands close to his body to avoid being grabbed by an opponent. He was a big man, and I guess he had underestimated me, as many people do, because I typically adopt an unassuming demeanor. I'm an introvert, and I'm also totally comfortable with being an introvert. I don't feel a pressing desire to prove myself to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that I meet. He was feeling pretty confident, and he was intent on demonstrating to me in front of my class how ineffective my defensive position was. He went into a fighting stance, and I could see that he was intent on making the demonstration particularly demeaning for me and to teach me a lesson. So I did something I typically do not do for fear of accidentally hurting people. I said sure. I adopted a defensive position, and he attacked by grabbing onto my primary guard hand to drag me to the ground. However, what happened instead was that I bridged through his arm and pulsed and knocked him several feet back, where he nearly fell onto some hard gym equipment. I had a brief panic attack because he could have been badly hurt if he had fallen headfirst onto the equipment, but fortunately he managed to steady himself. He stood there dazed for a couple of seconds, with his arms at his side. All thought of defense and combat had apparently left his mind. I could see that he had absolutely no idea of what had just happened. And then he broke into a confused smile. We had a long talk about things afterwards, and he ended up saying that if he did not have so many years of training in other systems, that he would have wanted to train with me. This response I can respect. It's hard to unlearn everything that you have already learned and start from scratch again. The point of my story is that many people from typical Western schools of thought on combat cannot understand why traditional Kung Fu practice involves making contact with the opponent as quickly as possible. I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons is to establish a tactile response feedback loop, where the practitioner feels their opponent's position and movements so that they can react with a superior tactile response time. But are tactile response times faster than visual response times? Well, there is plenty of research to suggest that they are. An example of one of these research projects is finger response times to visual, auditory, and tactile modality stimuli from the Proceedings of the International Multi-Conference of Engineers and Computer Scientists, 2012, Volume 2, by Annie Ng and Alan Chan. They found that response times to visual stimuli were significantly longer than to tactile stimuli. The response time for visual stimuli was 34% longer than that for tactile stimuli. However, testing and comparing my own visual response time to my tactile response times was an interesting investigation that I could easily do in a video. So that's what I've done in this video. The equipment I used was fairly simple. The main piece of equipment being this multi-timer by Industrial Equipment and Control, or IEC, in Melbourne, Australia. It's been designed for accurate laboratory experimental work and has a very high resolution of 0.1 milliseconds. The speed and precision station that we use in the testing that we do on clientele for the Martial Arts Research and Testing Laboratory, I also used in these tests. I simply used the visual indicator light on the speed and precision station, which I had hooked up to this gun-shaped activator. It's not a real gun. It's just a wooden cutout with a multi-pole switch suitable for switching both the indicator light and activating the timer simultaneously. I also used a simple handheld push button activator to switch the timer off when I responded to the stimulus. The methodology was also quite simple. For the visual response test, I had the Wushu scientist stand off camera, obscured behind a screen, and she would switch the gun-shaped multi-pole switch, which would simultaneously start the timer and switch on the visual indicator light on the speed and precision station. I had the Wushu scientist concealed behind a screen so that I could receive no accidental body language cues from her prior to activating the timer. I turned up in one of my previous tests, one of my previous video investigations, that there may be some body language interpretation or body language cues that a trained individual could pick up from someone, which would interfere with the response, with visual response time testing. Once I saw the light, I would press the handheld push button to stop the timer. For the tactile response test, the Wushu scientist would poke me vigorously with the pokey stick push button to start the timer. This is the pokey stick push button. So it's really just a push button on the end of an old broomstick, which serves just fine to start the timer. I would then press the handheld push button as soon as I felt poked to stop the timer. During the tactile response test, I wore this blindfold to eliminate any kind of visual indication, so I was purely relying on tactile feedback to tell me when the timer had been activated. I performed the response time tests 10 times for both the visual response and the tactile response. And this is what the tests looked like. Okay, when you're ready. Okay, so it's 0.13. through. Reset. When you're ready. 0.1325. You ready? 0.1313. You ready? 1324. You ready? 1342. You ready? 1342. You ready? 0.09219. Are you ready? 1368. You ready? 1148. You ready? 1269. Okay, whenever you're ready. Point 0936. Point 0749. Point 0653. Zero 0970. And 0776. 1019. 0740. 1048. 0466. 567. Yeah, we did. So the results were quite interesting for a number of reasons. I plotted my visual and tactile response times on the same set of axes, and this is what they looked like. As you can see, my tactile response times were considerably faster than my visual response times. My average visual response time was approximately 126 milliseconds, and my average tactile response time was approximately 84 milliseconds. My average tactile response time was thus approximately 33% better than my visual response time. This is almost identical to the 34% improvement shown in the study by Annie Ning and Alan Chan mentioned earlier. The other interesting takeaway from my tests was that all of my response times were quite fast, as you would expect for a trained individual. However, they were very fast indeed. As mentioned previously, my average visual response time was approximately 126 milliseconds. My fastest visual response time was approximately 92 milliseconds. At this point, we can look at a few references to human reaction and response times. There are many references in terms of average and record reaction and response times, and they're all slightly different, so I've dragged up a few for consideration. Reference number 1 is from the Human Benchmark website, which has reportedly recorded over 81 million reaction time clicks since it was created. According to this website, the median reaction time is 273 milliseconds. Reference number 2 is from the reference.com website, which calls itself the go-to general knowledge resource for students and curious individuals. And in this case, it's from a search for the fastest human reaction time. This website claims that 101 milliseconds is the current fastest reaction time recorded for human beings. The average reaction time of human beings is around 215 milliseconds, according to this website. This is determined by the amount of time it takes for people to react when given the proper signal to click. Reference number 3 is also from the reference.com website, except that it was from a search for average human reaction times. And it indicates that some sexual dimorphism may exist in reaction times, particularly to auditory stimuli, according to a study published in 2011 by PLOS ONE. Beijing Olympic runners were measured for their reaction times, and the results concluded that male runners had an average reaction time of 166 milliseconds, while female runners had an average of 189 milliseconds. In the same test, researchers determined that in 1 out of 1,000 starts, a male and female sprinter could achieve a reaction time of 109 milliseconds and 121 milliseconds, respectively. Reference number 4 is from a study entitled A Comparative Study of Visual and Auditory Reaction Times on the Basis of Gender and Physical Activity Levels of Medical First-Year Students, which was published in the International Journal of Applied and Basic Medical Research in 2015 by Aditya Jain, Remta Banzai, Avnish Kumar, and KD Singh. They found that the average visual reaction time of a group of 120 medical students was approximately 247 milliseconds. In addition, according to their statistical analysis of the overall comparison between sedentary and regularly exercising healthy medical students, significant differences were found, indicating that sedentary medical students have slower reaction times. In comparison to these published results, some of which were for trained Olympic runners that rely on response times to get good starts for their performances, my results are actually quite significant. In order to compare my results with the other published results, I prepared a bar chart showing the published average and record response times in comparison to my own. And this is what it looked like. The references I used are listed below the plot, and they're the references 1 to 4 that I mentioned earlier. I have color-coded the bars with the first 4 blue bars representing the average reaction times from the 4 references, the next 2 red bars representing record fastest reaction times, the next 2 purple bars representing my record fastest reaction times, both visual and tactile, and the final 2 green bars representing my average response times, both visual and tactile. As you can see, my average visual response time was approximately 40 milliseconds faster than the fastest average response time in the references, and was only 25 milliseconds slower than the fastest reaction time that I found in the references. My fastest visual response time was approximately 8 milliseconds faster than the fastest human reaction time I could find in the references. It gets really interesting when my tactile response time is considered. My average tactile response time was approximately 17 milliseconds faster than the fastest human reaction time I could find in the references. My fastest tactile response time was approximately 55 milliseconds faster than the fastest human reaction time I could find in the references. So to put that into perspective, my fastest tactile response time was more than twice as fast as the fastest human reaction time in the references that I found. As a bit of fun, to revisit my old Can a Martial Artist Dodge a Bullet video, with that response time and taking for granted that I could receive a tactile stimulus when the gun is fired, and that I was able to somehow know the bullet's trajectory without resorting to vision, it may just be possible to dodge a bullet fired from less than 20 meters away, which is crazy. Another takeaway from the results is related to the percentage difference between my tactile and visual response times, which was almost identical to that shown in the study by Annie Ning and Alan Chan. This would suggest that the traditional training program does not specifically improve tactile response times alone, but instead improves all response times, because although my response times were superior to those of the reference studies, the percentage difference between the two, between visual and tactile, was still identical. This hints at the fact that the training program trains the raw response mechanism itself. Finally, the comparative study of visual and auditory reaction times on the basis of gender and physical activity levels of medical first-year students by Aditya Jain, Ramta Banzai, Avnish Kumar, and KD Singh found that regular exercise significantly improves reaction times. This should be borne in mind by those who wish to improve reaction and response times. So hopefully these results set the context and explain why traditional Kung Fu places so much emphasis on developing tactile sensitivity in its practitioners through training, and in establishing tactile feedback loops with an opponent. If your tactile response times are easily twice as fast as the fastest visual response times of your opponent, well, that's a significant advantage in combat. I was thinking about doing a follow-up video to this one detailing some of the overarching training principles employed in traditional martial arts to improve response times. Let me know in the comments section below if you'd like to see a broad brushstrokes how-to video. I'll see you next time. Cheers!